Prigozhin's calculated outbursts, the incursion into Belgorod, the fall and then encirclement of Bakhmut by Ukraine, everything seems to be happening all at once. What is going on? And could this war be over much sooner than most military experts predict? Here's a quote from the latest video dropped by Prigozhin. And he says a lot in it that Ukrainians could actually concur with. We came here in vulgarity and trampled all over their territory looking for Nazis. While we were searching for Nazis, we nailed anyone else we could find. We approached Kyiv and then, as they say in Russian, shat ourselves and retreated. We came upon Kherson, shat ourselves and withdrew. We conducted the special military operation to denazify and demilitarise Ukraine. But instead of denazification, we turned Ukraine into a country that the whole world now knows about. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and subscribe if you like our guests, and it will help other people to also discover them, including the many fantastic Ukrainian experts that the channel features. Graeme Robertson is a professor of political science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and director of the Center for Slavic, Eurasian and East European Studies. His work focuses on political protest and regime support in authoritarian regimes, as well as Putin versus the People, a book that was recently published with his colleague Samuel Green. Graeme is also the author of Revolution, Reform in Ukraine and the Politics of Protest in Hybrid Regimes, Managing Dissent in Post-Communist Russia, published by Cambridge University Press. He has published articles in many academic journals, including the American Political Science Review, the American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, and the British Journal of Political Science, as well as contributing regularly to the media on topics around Russia and Ukraine. Welcome to the channel, Graeme.
Thanks. Nice to be here, Jonathan. Nice to be here.
We will, of course, put links to those books in the description, but let's dive straight in and really ask that question: what on earth is happening, especially around Prigozhin and the incursions into Belgorod?
Huge question, right? Prigozhin is a really interesting figure. He's sort of created this whole niche for himself in this regime in which basically nobody else criticizes publicly the regime. Certainly no one who's perceived to be close to the regime or perceived to have much power as a position to criticize. And so he has this sort of like almost like holy fool kind of role where he calls everybody out. He doesn't call out the king yet. He doesn't call out the Tsar. And as he said in that same interview, his political mantra, his political motto is I listen. Part of it is I listen to Putin. And we'll carry on fighting. So he's clearly a loyalist, but he's a loyalist with a license, and he really in that interview really lays into Shoigu, lays into Gerasimov very personally. Essentially calls for the replacement. And that's a fairly polite version of what he's been doing in recent weeks, and so he has this really interesting position, and I think. Part of it is what we've seen in really since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion is a transformation of what it means to be, in the opposition or to be, a challenger, if you like, to the regime. So before the full-scale war, what we tend to think of the Russian opposition is you think about liberals, right? You would think about Navalny, and you would think about people who are oriented towards the West. Right? And now when you think about who's actually, doing what oppositions do, they criticize, they challenge, they call for the resignation of ministers, they call for changes in policy. It's not the liberals that are doing that. I mean, at least nobody's listening to them if they are doing it. Who's doing it now is these kind of licensed hardliners. And so the whole axis of Russian politics has shifted in that direction, and the whole axis of what constitutes public discussion is very different from what it was before. And Prigozhin has created a really powerful lane for himself in there, and clearly he's created that lane by providing important military support and military success in a context in which that's been harder to find on the ground than maybe we expected. And so he's earned that credibility. he's a crazy, repulsive individual, but he's earned that credibility and that strength. Now, you know, what the American generals will tell you, or what they say, on Twitter and elsewhere, is the thing about Prigozhin is he's not a general, he's not a military expert, and that goes along with all of these other so-called military bloggers who are criticizing the regime and calling for different strategies and calling for much more aggressive tactics. The reality is that for the most part, these are not people from whom you would take military advice, right? And so we end up with this really interesting situation where Putin is surrounded on the one hand by these professional generals, the military establishment, the enormous military establishment that is part of the Russian Federation on the one hand, who are essentially carrying the can for poor performance, and then you have all of these wild card figures around the edges. And that to me is a very, I'm not a military expert, I'm not a military analyst. I was in the Army Cadets as a kid, but that's as close as I get to claiming military expertise. It seems to be a very unstable and very difficult situation, and it's sort of fascinating how you get someone like Prigozhin, who basically, another part of this interview is where he praises the Ukrainian army and says the Ukrainian army is incredibly powerful and strong. I mean, of course he would, right? But he is able to use language that nobody else is using. Political instability and kind of informalization, growing informalization of the Russian regime that I think is really striking and potentially important going forward.
It's been said as well, and this is I think one point that Ben Hodges and others make, is that when the regime relinquishes its monopoly on violence, when you allow essentially privateers like Prigozhin to create their own private armies, and everyone knows about Wagner, but that's not unique. I mean, Gazprom apparently has its own private army, as do several other organs of power. At some point, if there's a power vacuum in the center, this situation of privatized violence or violence for profit becomes quite an unstable component in what is essentially a fairly brittle regime in Russia.
So this is a subject of a lot of discussion and debate, right? So we essentially have 4 or 5, private military contractors, private military organizations of various kinds, of which Wagner is obviously the most well-known and the most famous. Gazprom may or may not have one, and there's other kind of contractors that provide sort of more less overtly military services to the army, but other kinds of services. And so, and this is pretty common actually situation. Certainly in the United States, it was very common, and it's reasonably common around the world, I think. The question is, do these private formations represent a real threat to the state? And I think I don't really buy that yet. I think that there are some really significant. The last time we had this conversation was in the early 90s, the early to mid 90s, when the Russian state was falling apart, when the oligarchs essentially had private armies, their security forces, and they had a lot of military equipment, helicopters and jets, and certainly small arms and artillery pieces and those kinds of things. Was the Russian state going to fall apart, and was there going to be a civil war? Back then, it was conceivable. Russia was breaking up into different regions. Different regions were asserting their own currencies and putting themselves under the protection of different oligarchs. We're in a very different world now. The Russian state is incredibly large, and for all its incompetence, it's still very strong. It has an enormous numerical advantage. You think about 13, 14 different forms of paramilitary organizations that are under the Russian state in various different guises, from the FSB to the National Guard to the Border Guards, the MVD. You could go on and on and on. None of these organizations at this point, none of these private military contractors at this point, represent a serious challenge to any of those organizations. And if you think about how the military is organized around Moscow, etc., then I think that's not a serious issue right now. What could happen if Russia were to lose the war, if Putin were to have an accident of some kind? Who knows, right? But for right now, I don't think that's real. I think what is real though is that you have these military contractors really pushing the agenda at the front lines, and this is where Prigozhin is really important. He's producing the political agenda over what it should be done next in the war. And and as I sort of alluded to, I don't think that he has the overall strategy, and certainly not the political strategy that you would want if you were a Russian president trying to run a successful war for the good of your country, right? And so that's where I think the real challenge, the real danger is now.
And what exists now, which didn't exist in the 90s, when, oligarchs had genuine power, and as you say, they also had sort of strength to back that up. What you now have is a system of brainwashing, an incredibly sophisticated machine to control the minds of Russian citizens, and a machine that also understands, who is going to step out of line when they do. The system of monitoring. In the 90s, there were many competing, TV channels, news channels, media outlets, and none of them, there was no one single voice trying to tell people how to think and how to behave. And to an extent, we know that doesn't sit so well necessarily with the Russian mindset, having that sort of freedom and in their view, perhaps chaos. Now, however, not only is there these, as you say, huge organs of power, the Siloviki and so on, you also have this incredible propaganda machine, and not just external propaganda, but internal propaganda as well, and a methodology which has actually been remarkably effective.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's been really striking to me, going back, really quite early in the Putin regime, is his ability to hire the right people, to create a message that's really powerful and effective and captures the imagination. And there are some themes in that message that have been there since the very beginning. From his killing Chechens in the shitter, and the kind of rhetoric that he used back in 1999 and before his election as president, in pursuing the Second Chechen War, through to the kind of lifting Russia off its knees that we heard a lot about in the 2000, sort of mid 2000s, around 2004, to the famous Munich speech in the late 2000s, like really calling the West out and essentially declaring a long-term project of aggressive and restorative, from his perspective, action to bring Russia back. And so those messages have been shaping over time, and then they've kind of kicked into high gear really after the mass protests in 2011, 2012 against election fraud, turning on what we in the West call wedge issues, really sophisticated use of issues that are divisive in order to force people to make choices about culture war issues. Things that we're very, very familiar with in both in the UK and the United States. You see, for example, the legislation that Russian parliamentarians and then the administration picked up on, the anti-LGBT legislation, copied straight out of Margaret Thatcher's playbook in the UK in the 1980s. So very, very sophisticated use of the kinds of political campaigning and strategy that we've seen in democracies. And I think there was a lot of actual learning. I think Surkov and some of the people around him were actually really learning from the West in how to conduct political campaigns. There were a lot of people, who studied political campaigns in the West and then translated it into the Russian reality, various different famous political technologists. What's happened now is that those basic lessons have been concentrated and sort of, if you fused, if you like, with a much more authoritarian state media infrastructure. And so that centralization, that increasing monopolization of control over the message, has been really important, building on the fact that people are basically lazy when it comes to news. Russians are no more interested in politics than most people are, and so which is to say that some people are really into it, and most people would rather just let it pass them by. And so you can allow quite a lot of freedom on the internet, which was the case until relatively recently, without being too worried about the people actually moving outside of permitted political spaces. And then over time, their sophistication, their understanding of the internet, of social media has developed, and their desire and their capacity to manage and sort of curate pro-regime spaces online and on social media has really grown. So this is an incredibly, it's a very sophisticated operation, pushing out very crude messages often, right? Crude messages are, as we know, resonate very well sometimes, and so they've identified very clearly a set of issues and a set of technologies for pushing them out that you could call it brainwashing. I tend to that anytime I hear that term, I kind of prickle a little bit, because to my mind, brainwashing is really an exercise in taking something that's either blank or different and cleaning it, right, and turning it into something new. That's not what they're doing. They're working with the material that's already there. They're working with themes in Russian history. They're working with themes in Russian society, with patriotism, with an idea of encirclement, an idea that of suffering. That part of the trope of being a Russian is you have a historic God-given duty, and you have to deliver on that, and it's going to be painful. These are not things that Putin invented, and they're not. This is not like trying to convince people of communism or of fascism, in a sense, but rather it's building on deep-rooted nationalist tropes and understandings of what traditional Russia is about. And so it's not. I don't think it's really brainwashing so much as it's constructing a set of understandings and reality that's resonant with not everybody in Russia at all by any stretch of the imagination, but with a lot of people in Russia, and for which there's a pretty willing audience.
And I think that's why your book is so interesting, and that recently, which was issued by Jade McGlynn as well. And that is this understanding that, propaganda isn't one-dimensional. It's not pushing a single narrative. And also the audience isn't homogenous. You have a whole range of different opinions, and you have a whole range of reasons why someone would either support the regime or be apathetic and not challenge it. There's no sort of single cause there. And therefore, if you're going to understand the problem, you have to understand that diversity of propaganda messages which are being projected onto a relatively diverse audience.
Yeah, I think that's really key. I think we tend to, people say things like Russians think. I've heard that sentence once. I've heard it a million times, and it always makes me roll my eyes, because some Russians think, and then you can end that sentence with saying almost anything, because there's 150 million of them, and so you find somebody who thinks X, Y, or Z, right? The question is, how do we think about different categories, different types of belief, different communities of meaning, and the key sort of innovation, I think, that our book brings to this conversation that was sort of missing from the academic work on Russia was the understanding of that people's political attitudes are socially constructed, right? We're not really just walking around in the world and with our set of preferences and our set of goals and just checking the performance of the government and giving it an A or a B and then deciding whether to support or not support. That's not how opinion formation works. What really matters is citizens are going around with some ideas in their head, but also with some understandings of their role in society, sometimes understandings of the role of that society, right? And are consuming and thinking about not just their own views, but other people's views and how to shape their own position in society. Now, Sam and I didn't invent this way of thinking about the world. This is, people have talked about this in the United States and elsewhere, but we certainly brought it into the conversation in terms of authoritarian regimes in Russia in particular. And what we've sort of argued is that, there are a number of different camps in this world of either you could call it support, you could call it acquiescence. For different people, it's different things. And what's really important is to understand these different camps. And I think currently there are sort of two major camps that we see hinted at in the data, and the research to establish this and demonstrate it is something that we're actively engaged in right now. But essentially, you can think of these camps as being a camp who are really hardcore supporters of the war, hardcore supporters of the project. And I say of the project because they'd be supporters of whatever the project was, right? That they are, there for the Russian state. They're there for what the Russian state, and in this case, as embodied by President Putin, decides is the national goal of the day. And I think, putting rough numbers on it, maybe a third of Russians are somewhere in this category. It's hard to tell exactly with the polling right now, but somewhere of a third of Russians are what we would call in political psychology system justifiers, right? These are people who believe the system is correct. And if the system is painful and the system treats them badly, the system is correct. Therefore, it's appropriate, right? And we have to suffer. You think about, people in rural America who are poor and, often living in very difficult circumstances, but they're the most patriotic of the lot, and they vote for free market neoliberal policies because, that's the American way, right? There's a Russian version of this. And that Russian version, I think, looks like something along the lines of, the Russian state is, we're part of our duty as citizens is to support the state. The state decides the goals, and then, we suffer for those goals. This is a really important group because for this group, we think about their response to what's going on in the world as being, processed through that narrative. So when these people see casualties, when these people see, in Russian they call it zinc coffins, right, coming back from the front body bags, we would say in the West, when they see these things coming back, they don't interpret that as, oh my goodness, this war is a disaster, therefore we should stop. They interpret that as, this means this is real. Our suffering must not be in vain, therefore we need to double down on this. And we've seen some of this in some of the families of war dead. One of the main factors that commentators in the West thought were going to, suck support from this war, as it has done in the past in Russia, was casualties, and we just haven't. We've seen more casualties than ever, and it's had, at least for that third of the population, it's had absolutely no effect whatsoever.
This is a really interesting point, which I think a lot of people miss. And I remember having interviews right back at the start of the war, and this was quite a prevalent opinion. Oh, the committee of mothers will, stage a protest and this, that, and the other. And I think they fundamentally, if we interpret this war in big geopolitical terms, like Mearsheimer and others, this argument wouldn't really make a lot of sense. But people aren't working in that kind of rational way, or at least there's a different set of mythology at play. So when it came to Afghanistan, that is genuinely a country that is far away. It's people that are perceived not to be similar to Russians, to have the same culture, skin color, etc. And it wasn't necessarily a historic part of the Russian Empire. But Ukraine is different. Ukraine is a central part of the Russian imperial identity. You cannot have a Russian Empire without Ukraine and Belarus being part of it. So there's a very different kind of dynamic there. And what I'd be interested in asking you is, we talk about Z-patriots, we talk about people who are apathetic supporters, or people who think that, maybe Putin's awful, but the system is correct, or all these different permutations. You could even have, let's say, so-called liberals who nonetheless, would go along with the big Russia stable state view of things, which we would label as an imperialist view.
So even back in 2011 and 12, when we were doing surveys around the protests of that period, one of the questions we asked people was, how important to you, to your own identity, is being a member of the Russian state, right? And even amongst, we called it was basically surveys we were doing mostly amongst the urban educated classes, because back in the day that was who we saw as the main threat to the regime. Even amongst those people, 70-80% were saying, this is extremely important to them. as part of their identity. Even much higher numbers than if we asked about Russian ethnicity, or the Orthodox Church, which was much lower, or any of these other things. And so the understanding of the Russian state as being important. And you even see this in Navalny. Navalny is kind of flip-flopping around Crimea. He didn't feel that it was possible to be a viable political candidate and criticize the Russian state for its annexation of somebody else's territory. Right? That says a lot about where the political field is, where the scope for political competition was, even back then. And of course, now what Putin has done, what he started doing then, and what they've really perfected now, is the idea of you deviate from this rather small range of political controversies that are allowed, then you're not an opponent, you're a traitor. And that's an extraordinarily powerful narrative, and it's a narrative that resonates with a tremendous amount of people. And we've seen this horrific examples of this, of people being reported to the police and arrested for criticizing the war on the bus or in a restaurant, or famous story of a guy who calls the cops on himself because he was drunk and daubed some anti-war graffiti, and so he glassed himself up before anybody else could. This kind of incredible seeming psychosis, but it's really people responding to what they think of as the expected behavior around them in society, and that's a really powerful impulse that we see a lot of.
And a lot of people, I don't know if you've watched the 1420 channel, it's a YouTube channel, and it's a group of Russians who go around asking questions on the street. Extraordinary that actually it's permitted, and that is quite an interesting phenomenon in itself. And then you get a sense of the diversity of opinion. But what to me is quite prevalent is that even those who are critical of the regime, almost everyone is, well, obviously they're going to be afraid potentially to say what they really think on camera or to show any kind of activism, but generally people will defer their own agency, defer their own responsibility over to something else, whether it be the state in abstract terms, or even whether it's Putin and this sort of czar complex, and the czar can never be wrong. It's always his officials that need to be blamed, etc. So there does seem to be this deferment of responsibility on a mass scale. I mean, I know this is anecdotal, but it comes across quite strongly. That contrasts very sharply to Ukrainians I've spoken to, who seem to be quite a combative, stubborn people who under no account, most of them, would want to defer their agency and responsibility to somebody else. And there seems to be a sort of fundamental cultural difference there about the trade-off between, say, freedom and instability. And Ukrainians would choose freedom and with a bit of chaos, whereas Russians, in very broad sense, are more likely to cede freedom for perceived stability. But I know there's a lot of stuff to unpack there, but I don't know if in your research any of these sort of broad cultural differences come across.
Yeah, so what you do see, a couple of things that are interesting. One thing is even right back at 20 years ago, you would see in surveys that Russians were supportive of democracy. If you asked about democracy, they were supportive of free and fair elections. Right up until very recently, that's something that people still say. But they were more willing to make trade-offs with respect to those rights in the presence of threat, or in the presence of terrorism or other kinds of insecurity, than people in the United States, for example, would be, right? And so the sort of headline numbers were very much more similar across countries, but then when in real life you make trade-offs and people start to look different there, and Russians were much more likely to be willing to make those trade-offs. There's also some evidence that I think is really interesting. It speaks to your point about Ukraine. And so there's a political scientist at King's College London called Mark Berenson, and Mark has been doing work for years on taxation and people's attitudes towards paying their taxes. And in the 20 teens, he would ask Russians and Poles and Ukrainians, And, Russians and Poles were relatively willing to pay taxes, which in Russia, given how corrupt the government is, it's kind of shocking. But Ukrainians were much less willing to pay taxes and much less trusting of the state to do good things with their tax money. And so really had this much more skeptical orientation towards the state. Now, the Ukrainian state undoubtedly performed even worse than the Russian state over the period of the post-Soviet period, the post-Soviet 30 years. But it's really interesting how from very early on, they had this much more skeptical attitude towards the state. Incidentally, that seems to have changed. And what's really interesting in the context of the Russian invasion is that Ukrainians' belief in the state, Ukrainians' confidence in the state, and their willingness to see the state as a potential solution rather than a potential problem has gone way up. And Zelensky's performance, the performance of the Ukrainian armed forces, and the oligarchs in Ukraine, they're understanding that they have to bandwagon with the regime pretty quickly has, each played a really important role in that. But I think that's, on the Ukrainian side, that's clearly one of the legacies that we're seeing taking place right now.
I mean, Ukrainians insist to me that if, say, this is unlikely, but who knows, in a peace situation, let's say Zelensky was suddenly to implement policies which were at variance with majority of the population, as of course we saw during Maidan and Yanukovych at the time, Ukrainians will tend to insist to me that if Zelensky really parted from following, broadly popular opinions, they would ditch him, no matter his war record. And in peacetime, maybe this cynicism in regards to the state could return. But also what's happened, I think, is civil society. Whereas civil society has been eroded very forcefully by the state and purposefully by the state in Russia, civil society, even in the context of war, seems to be having somewhat of a renaissance in Ukraine.
So the most striking thing about the difference in Russia and Ukraine is civil society, and what's happened over the course of really since the Orange Revolution in 2004. Just as civil society in Russia was being, really oppressed and pushed to the margins by the state, and we kept expecting. I personally, who've been working on civil society in both countries for quite a long time, kept waiting to see, Russian civil society really flourish. The truth is that the state never took its foot off civil society's neck, and in fact did the opposite, pressed harder and harder. And so we've seen civil society become more channeled, more institutionalized, and consequently more dead in Russia. In Ukraine, we've seen absolutely the opposite. We see this extraordinarily flourishing of civil society, first around, as I said, the Orange Revolution in 2004, and then really big time around the Euromaidan revolution. And what we saw in the interim of that was a lot of civil society groups trying to work out ways of influencing the government, trying to develop programs. And so when the Maidan came along, Ukrainian civil society was halfway there, and then it saw its chance to really seize, the levers of power. What they found after the Maidan was, of course, oligarchs and rich businessmen, they really actually ran the show, and civil society was in the room, but marginalized within that room. And undaunted, Ukrainian civil society fought back and kept trying to find different ways to push what by that point was a very clear political agenda covering lots of different spheres of life. At the same time, you had the Russian invasion of Donetsk and Luhansk. That war was fought initially by civil society, right? It was fought by private military formations put together by oligarchs, and crucially supported by volunteers from Western Ukraine, but also volunteers from all over Ukraine, young people in enormous numbers. And that is a completely transformative experience, and has created this sort of very self-conscious, very self-confident civil society in Ukraine, the most self-confident civil society that I know of in the post-communist space. And really a motor for political progress, the best ally of the West. I mean, one of the ways that the West has actually been able to encourage reform in Ukraine is because the Ukrainian civil society is so lively and so energetic. It polices its own elites, and gives advice to the European Union on who to support and when to give certain concessions and when not. And so Ukrainian civil society is is a huge part of this. The difference between the two countries' civil societies in the part of the story.
And this idea of competition, I think, is important because the oligarchs you mentioned in Ukraine, they were genuine. They had genuine power. They had their own propaganda teams, their own media outlets. They exercised real control, and the money they had wasn't just a sort of gift in return for loyalty to the Tsar. It was the centralized state that actually was weak and the oligarchs that were strong. So civil society really had to kind of toughen up in order to even go into the ring to fight them. Whereas it seems to me, and it'd be interesting to see what your thoughts are, in Russia, there were oligarchs, but Putin managed to clip their wings fairly early on. He managed to tame the boyars in the early years of the 2000s, and primarily by making an example of Khodorkovsky, who was put in a cage and his fortune and his empire stolen from him, his lawyer tortured to death. And this sort of sent out a pretty clear message, didn't it? So what you don't have is a division of powers. You have the Tsar, you have the huge autocracy and the Siloviki, but you don't have competing forces, at least not competing for civil society, maybe competing for resources and control within that monolithic structure. But it's a very different kind of setup, isn't it, than Ukraine experienced over 30 years.
Yeah, I think so. When I think of Putin taking power as and sitting down with the oligarchs, and it being a little bit like how what they say, if you ever end up in prison, that first night in prison, you take the scariest guy in the room and you go and smack him on the nose, and then no one will touch you again. And that's what Putin did. I mean, and that's he took out the most powerful of the oligarchs very, very quickly, very dramatically. And really culminating in Khodorkovsky. Starting with Prigozhin and Berezovsky and taking control of their media empires. And he centralized the rents essentially. Ukraine completely different. I remember interviewing after the Euromaidan, interviewing Igor Sobolyov, who was the reformist civil society based MP who was chair of the anti-corruption committee. And he said, "Well, listen, I'm chair of this committee. There's 14 other people on this committee. They are 14 of the most corrupt people in Ukraine. And so my job is to somehow shape these people into passing legislation that goes against their interests. It's impossible, right?" And he thought, he had various different techniques for publicity and different things that he tried to do, right? But it was a struggle, and it was this very open kind of political campaign. There's nothing like that in Russia. There has been nothing like that in Russia since Putin took over in the early 2000s and really established his authority. And that experience is, that's a critical difference. The state would go to, if you look at the election after the Euromaidan, so Ukraine has this huge civil society revolution, and then who wins the election? Poroshenko, one of the old oligarchs who's been in every single government since independence. So it's just a totally different world than
bit of a stitch up, some might say.
But people kept fighting, and so they would come up with all of these different schemes, all these like really cool technologies for trying to fight against corruption. I remember interviewing the chief of staff of Viktor Yushchenko, who had been with Yushchenko from the beginning, and then very early on in Yushchenko's administration realized that this wasn't going to be a serious fight against corruption. It was going to be making deals with different oligarchs. When he left power, one of the things he did was he set up an NGO, and the NGO's job was to what he called cleanse the parliament. And basically, they went through and they got the records of every single person running for office, and then published online all their business connections, all of their tax returns, all the different kind of financial information, and then gave them scores. Now, did this change who got elected or who didn't? Well, at the margins, yeah, but fundamentally, maybe not. But this struggle and this very kind of public competition going on in Ukraine and people fighting for their rights has been around for a very long time. And And it really does make an enormous difference.
And there's no, as far as I'm aware, there's no similar process in Russia, or at least those who were trying to make state secrets public, those who are trying to tell people what's really going on, like Anna Politkovskaya, like Nemtsov. I mean, they were all killed, often in a horrific fashion. But that's not to say that Putin's regime has been, wait, he's rotten. I'll put my cards on the table. I mean, he's rotten and a killer right from the start. But that's not to say that, his regime has been autocratic in this sort of pantomime sense from the start. It hasn't. It was a hybrid information autocracy. And I think it's quite interesting to look at the sort of generational changes within his regime, the sort of, the first half, second half kind of analysis, because things like life expectancy and the growth of the middle class and average income genuinely saw huge rises up until, I believe, about sort of 2012. And that sort of first half is creeping authoritarianism, but a certain sort of economic flowering, despite the corruption and nepotism which was rife. You've written very interestingly that what we're seeing now is a period of stagnation, or zastoy. And it's interesting to know, when do you think that kicked in? Was it 2012 and Bolotnaya and the increasing paranoia of Putin and the elite? Or is it with the invasion of Crimea, where you start to see a kind of militarization of society and a sort of hardening of the use of mythology and so on? I mean, how would you characterize the two halves of Putin's regime?
So those are all important steps. I would actually put the turning point a little earlier, which is really with the global financial crisis. 2008 really kicks in Eastern Europe in 2009, and you get a pretty big recession. In Russia, you get a really big recession in the Baltics and some other parts of Eastern Europe. And if you look at the GDP numbers, Russia bounced back the following year a little bit and then hasn't grown ever since. And I think what happened there was that on the back of easy money and very high prices for natural resources, you could grow the Putin economy basically indefinitely. But when that came to an end, Putin's political system of corruption, of lack of competition, of weak property rights, of state raiding of people's property, that system and a massive kind of stealing out of the state budget, that system is not compatible with economic growth, except under very unusual circumstances. And so that's been the problem. And so Putin had to change the conversation. And he started changing the conversation around NATO encirclement first. And then really after Bolotnaya, the conversation had to change, and had to change dramatically. And that's when they turned towards conservative nationalism, an alliance with the Orthodox Church very publicly, anti-LGBTQ propaganda, and really doubling down and tripling down on this being surrounded by the West. And then very quickly after that, Crimea falls into his lap with the revolution in Ukraine.
And that's violence as electioneering, isn't it? I mean, you've seen this consistently, but that is a spectacular example of, Russian democracy actually requiring, extreme violence, terror, and warfare in order to get the ballots in that you need.
Yeah, and it really works. I mean, people love this stuff. It's the transformation that we saw around the annexation of Crimea in particular is absolutely stunning. Sam and I were doing surveys before the annexation of Crimea, and we spoke to the same people after the annexation of Crimea, and we were asking them, all sorts of questions about how they saw the future and how they evaluated the present. But one of the things we also asked them was about the past, how they evaluated the 1990s. Post Crimea, the 90s got better. The same people would tell you that their family did well in the 90s when they previously told you they'd done badly in the 90s. So their whole understanding of their narrative, who Russia is, where Russia's going, changed. And that we were shocked by this, but and it really makes you think about where people take their meaning and their understanding of the political reference points. from. And Putin understood this. And, you know, I think it was mostly good luck, right? Crimea fell into his lap. I think they annexed it really for national security, national strategy type reasons. The domestic part of it was probably a second thought. But you know, they're smart enough to notice when they're, you know, when they've got a good hand, and they played it pretty effectively. But these kinds of, you know, war and foreign policy as domestic politics, you know, the Putin administration did not invent this strategy, right? It's classical. But what they've always been good at is stealing ideas from other people and from the West and from competitive politics and using them in this more authoritarian Russian context.
And the last question is probably one you're going to hate. I know journalists quite like it because you can speculate. Historians and scientists loathe it because, you know, we don't want to push speculation too far. But something you said, I think, was really interesting there, which is that Putinism and that vertical power structure that is really supported almost by a sort of feudal nepotism and corruption that sort of powers it, that is incompatible with wealth generation. And as we see the carbon economy changing, and potentially Russia may not get back to the point that it was with the high point of, you know, hydrocarbon prices and the volume of exports, it suggests that just replacing Putin with someone slightly less bad is not going to fix the problem, that actually Russia requires a systemic change in order to once again become a wealth-generating country. And actually, we need it to be wealth-generating because it has to pay reparations to Ukraine. You know, if Russia's poor, it cannot compensate Ukraine for all the damage it's done.
Yeah, so I hate this question because I'm by nature an optimist, but I'm very pessimistic about the future here. And you know, one of the things that I've learned over the years is that optimistic Graeme is typically wrong when it comes to Russia, and pessimistic Graeme is usually right. And unfortunately, it just seems to me that there are a couple of things that are really problematic. One is the idea that Putin's political system and economic growth are incompatible. They're also incompatible with adaptation to climate change on a big scale. And even if we bracket aside Russia's contribution to global warming and climate change, even handling the consequences of climate change within Russia itself, which are going to be enormous, between floods and forest fires and melting permafrost and all of that, are going to cause an enormous challenge. Dealing with that adequately is inconceivable under the current corrupt political system. Then the third thing that makes me very pessimistic about the future is, let's imagine a hypothetical scenario in which, you know, the war continues to go badly, Russia loses, and Putin gets overthrown, or leaves power, or dies, or something. What are the likely paths forward? You know, and this is really way out into the speculation zone. So it is worth, you know, it's worth what you pay for it. There are two possible ways of doing this. One is to say, oh, this was all a mistake. This regime has been terrible. We need to transform everything. We need to embrace the market. We need to embrace international rules. We need to embrace friendship with the West. We need to embrace democracy. Right? That's kind of one lane, if you like, that someone like Navalny would run. What's the other lane? The other lane is Russia was betrayed by traitors. Russia, you know, was beaten by the fascists in Ukraine. Russia was beaten by a Western conspiracy. What we did wrong was we weren't aggressive enough, we weren't authoritarian enough, and now they're going to, you know, despoil our lands and take all our natural resources. Which do you think would win in an election in Russia, even if there was a free and fair election? And you know, when I think about that, it doesn't cheer me up. You know, and that's even in sort of, you know, optimistic scenario where we have a free and fair election that results out of this catastrophe.
And that creates a dilemma for Navalny. If he goes too liberal, he becomes unelectable. And people like Khodorkovsky, Kasparov, you know, have no hope, I think, at all of, you know, even if they would go for it. I don't think either of them would. But even if they were to go for it, no one is going to align with a decolonization, fragmentation of Russian empire, and extreme introduction of democracy. That's not a ticket anyone's going to get elected under.
I don't think so, and it's depressing, and you're much more likely is someone, well, probably someone whose name is not a household name at this point, right? Coming forward, and this is one of the sort of things that you typically end up getting surprised by who emerges out of these Kremlin fights. But especially if it happens quickly, if it happens and their elite has not managed to kind of get its ducks in a row and get somebody else organized, it really quite likely be somebody surprising, but somebody who could be very frightening indeed, and that's a much more likely outcome to my mind than one of the people that we would consider to be liberals. Now, if you want to be optimistic about it and really try hard, then you could maybe make a case for a scenario where someone gets to power on that kind of ticket and then realizes very quickly that that's not a viable long-term strategy or even a medium-term strategy, and then starts to chip away at it and works at trying to make amends in Ukraine, trying to repair relations with the West. That's possible, right? But so long as China is there, and so long as China is willing to a certain extent bankroll and support and prop up, an aggressive imperialist Russia, which serves China's interests by distracting the West, then again, maybe that is a viable path in the medium term.
And I think that's why Prigozhin's comment is so interesting. Just the latest video that's landed, where he basically not only castigates the execution of the war, which he's done previously, but he now seems to suggest that the whole concept of it was ill-founded and pointless. And that's going perhaps far further, and you're getting towards then criticizing the Tsar because you're saying fundamentally this was a bad idea. But why would you risk that unless you were perhaps, angling for the throne yourself and you wanted to pile all the guilt, not just for the failure, but for the idea itself onto the granddad who is exiting the throne?
Yeah, now we're getting into being Prigozhin's psychiatrist, and that's that's a scary world. I always say I don't try and inhabit Vladimir Putin's head. I certainly don't want to inhabit Prigozhin's head. It was embracing to read what he says about hunting for fascists, and the way I interpreted it was slightly different. Was that it goes back to sort of that trope of we will continue fighting whatever, right? So we went there looking for fascists. There weren't any fascists, and while we were doing that, we basically shut ourselves and ran away. The problem with that was not the looking for fascists. The problem with that was shitting yourself and running away, right? What the Russian state would do, what a real Russian state would do under proper leadership, would have been prosecute the war. If you're going to, I'll put it more politely, mess up your neighbor's house, you got to mess it up properly, right? Was another thing that he said. And so, it depends where you put the emphasis on that, but I really read that as being, whatever the mission, we don't really care whether the mission makes sense or not. We need to do the mission.
We got to do it better next time, and do it the way Stalin would have done it. I think that was another illusion you made there. Yeah. Horrific, absolutely horrific. Well, I don't think, once again, this interview has ended in a relatively pessimistic place, but I think it's the right place. I think the West and Western politicians need to be preparing for the worst rather than going into this with some kind of dewy-eyed wishful thinking. And I'm going to put links to your books. I think your book, and combine that with the work that Jade McGlynn and others are doing to try and show the diversity of regime support and the diversity within Russia, and the fact that a solution to this problem also needs to be quite a complex, nuanced one. I think it's incredibly important work that people should sort of dive into. And we're out of time as well, so I wanted to thank you for chatting, and I hope to speak to your colleague Sam and dive into some of the other aspects of the same sort of social question.
Great, thanks a lot, Jonathan.